Karen is described as a resilience expert, best-selling author and co-founder of the fantastic Grown Up Book Fair. Karen's journey speaks to strength, growth, and inspiration. She's a fierce advocate of resilience and overcoming life challenges. Please welcome Karen Dean.
Hello, everyone. I need to move. You guys are a hard act to follow, Laura and Laura. So, my story is about the scariest drive of my life. It was me and my Chevy Impala with my 5-year-old and 8-year-old in the back seat, following my mom in a beat-up U-Haul, like the biggest U-Haul we could find. And I kept looking in the ditches and the side roads and driveways, wondering where he might be hiding. And that drive seemed to take hours when it was really only about 45 minutes. Let me take you back a little bit. So I was young and full of energy and life, and I had just married the man who I wanted to spend the rest of my life with. He promised me everything that I ever dreamt of as a little girl. He was going to protect me and love me and provide financially for our family. I would never have to work. And if I did choose to go to work, I could keep all the money for myself to do whatever I wanted. By the way, we got married 5 months and 4 days after our first date. I don't recommend that. So we were starting our lives in this beautiful log home that he had built himself. And I had so many dreams for my future. I had just graduated from university the year before. But I was always taught that first and foremost, I should be a good wife and a good mother, and career and everything else came after that. So I jumped into that role. And we both wanted kids right away, so I stopped taking my birth control a few weeks before we got married, and wouldn't you know it, I got pregnant very quickly. And I remember running into his arms with that little drugstore pregnancy test showing 2 lines, and I was so excited that I was pregnant. I had baby names picked out since I was 13 years old, so this was like all my dreams were coming true. So imagine the shock when, as I ran into his arms in that excitement, that he looked me dead in the face and said, "Good, but if you ever leave me, I'll shoot you in the head when you drive out the driveway." And I'd seen him shoot a squirrel while it was running, so I knew he was a really good shot. And from that moment forward, I lived in fear of what might happen if I did try to leave. And it just kept getting worse and more abusive and more controlling. And I remember one day sitting in my glider rocking chair, talking to my best friend on the phone, and she said, "You need to leave. You can't stay there." And my daughter was only 2 at the time. And I said, "I can't leave. I don't even have a job. I have no money. I can't support myself. I can't be a single mom. I can't do this on my own." And I didn't feel safe, clearly, because almost weekly, he reminded me of that threat, that if I ever tried to leave, he would shoot me in the head when I drove out the driveway. It's pretty hard to let that go. So I stayed. And 3 years later, I gave birth to our second child. He was a save the marriage baby. Those don't work either. And when that little boy was 7.5 weeks old, I woke up one morning to find him like a rag doll. He wouldn't cry, he wouldn't eat. So I made the decision to drive an hour here to Halifax to the IWK Children's Hospital. My husband wouldn't come with me. He was too busy. So I called Ingrid, the young woman who babysat for us, to ask her if she could come to keep me company. So I picked her up on the way by her house, and we drove here to Halifax. And we got to the ER, and I only had time to change my son's diaper before the nurses took us back to the back. But they didn't just take us to like the bed with the curtain around it. They took us in a room with walls and a door. And I thought, okay, this is really serious. So they immediately started working on my little boy. Remember, he's only 7.5 weeks old. And they put an IV in his tiny little veins while he screamed, and I just sobbed on the bed beside him. And then they said, Mom, I think you should leave. We need to do a spinal tap, and I don't think you can handle that. So I went outside the room while they did that procedure, and it seemed to take hours while I listened to him scream, and I cried outside the room this time. And then we had CT scans and ultrasounds and x-rays and got the grand tour of the hospital to go to all of these departments. And then they said, you're not going home today. You're staying. So later that night, a doctor came in our room on the 7th floor, and he said, Mom, your little boy has reflux from his bladder, and it had caused a kidney infection that had gone into his blood, and he was septic. That means if I had have been an hour later getting him to the hospital, he probably would have died. So then the next day, still sitting alone in that hospital room with my little boy, a cardiology team came in to tell me that he had been born with a hole in his heart. Okay. Then on day 4, 5 neurologists came into the room. And when you're a little country woman and 5 neurologists walk in the room, you get scared. And they told me that my son had been born with a permanent brain injury, periventricular leukomalacia, and that I should prepare to have a completely dependent child. He probably isn't going to walk. He's probably not going to be able to talk. He's probably going to be in a wheelchair, and you might even have to tube feed him. And now you can go home. So I called my husband, and I had to wait almost 2 hours for him to show up at the hospital to drive us home. And on that drive home, I told him all the things that the doctor said because he wasn't there for any of it. And he immediately rejected that there could be anything wrong with his child. And he informed me that he will not be going to any stupid doctor's appointments with this kid, that I'm on my own. I took him, mostly with my daughter with us, to hundreds of medical professionals, every kind of help that I could find. And I made sure I asked questions about what I could do at home to help him. And 5 years later, that little boy walked onto the school bus, just like everybody else. And he started school without any adaptations or extra help. He was normal. He reprogrammed his brain. And then I got thinking, how'd that happen? And I thought, you know what? He believed he could because I believed he could, and because I encouraged him so much. So then I thought, if he can do the hard things, maybe I should start believing I can too. So 10 years after that wedding, I got brave enough to leave. And the night before I left, my ex-husband reminded me of that threat and said, "You're lucky I'm not a man of my word." So that's why that drive became the scariest drive of my life. But clearly he wasn't hiding in any ditches, and he didn't jump out, and I'm still here. But the nightmares weren't over. So I met a new guy on the rebound. He was great. And he promised to be a great dad to my kids. And as it turns out, that their real dad gave up all of his rights to them less than a year after we left and allowed my then boyfriend to adopt them. And we got married, and I had another baby. And in a repeat of the first marriage, as soon as I had the ring on my finger and the baby, he started becoming abusive. Not just to me, though. He was pretty abusive to my kids. And then one night, I walked into a conversation that I was not supposed to hear. And I learned that he had been sexually assaulting a teenage girl. And I immediately became a single mom to 3 kids who were 14, 10, and 3. I didn't have any other choice. And let me tell you, it was the scariest phone call I ever made to report that to the authorities. And the nightmares didn't end there. A few months later, my 14-year-old daughter had her lungs spontaneously collapse at school one day. And then the next summer, she lost 75% of her strength on her left side and all of the feeling on her right side over about a 2-week period. And finally, we got a diagnosis of multiple sclerosis, another one of those trips to the hospital where they said, nope, you're not going home today. You're going to stay. Then that little boy who fought so hard to have all the abilities that most of us normal people have, when he was 19, in the height of the COVID pandemic, he was diagnosed with a rare and aggressive form of cancer. So life will keep giving you different versions of the same lesson until you figure it out. And I had to figure out how I was going to help these kids become great adults. So I really started to look inward. And I really started to try to believe in myself. And when you know it, life really changed. When I started to feel like I was worth being loved. When I started to set boundaries with people who were trying to bring me down. When I started to find people who dreamed big dreams like I did. And once I started doing all that, I built a house and started a hobby farm from scratch to have a safe place for myself and my children. I raised $130,000 for families in Nova Scotia who were suffering from horrible tragedies. I published a book that became a Canadian bestseller. Then I published a self-love journal because I thought, you know what? I think other women need to learn the lessons that I have learned about how to love yourself. And I get on stages and inspire people to get through their hard things and understand that hard things don't mean you can't have an amazing life. So I learned to believe in myself. I learned to set those hard boundaries. And I learned that, holy smokes, I really can be a single mom. 13 years in now. And those kids, 2 are now adults. And they're strong, confident, kind, caring, successful kids. They'll always be my kids, but they're adults. And I don't think we give ourselves enough credit for the power that we give our kids by just showing them how to do it. So my little boy, when he was really trying hard to walk and to talk, I used to tell him there's no such thing as I can't. There's only I don't want to. So when I started applying that to my own life, that's when life started getting good. That's when I started living my dreams. And that's when I started being able to help other people do the same thing. So I want everyone to remember that you have everything you need inside of you to get through whatever life throws at you. Because just like me, you've survived every single one of your hard days so far.